I'm gonna wear black.
Welcome, everyone. My name is Antonio Biancardi. I'm Chief Operating Officer of AG Software. We build software to support R&D in the plumbing world. I'm also proud to be a member of the Board of Directors of the VRC. Welcome, everybody. I'd like to introduce Rebecca Harrow, our next panel leader here. Rebecca is an information privacy, security, and compliance consultant, author, and instructor who has provided assistance, advice, services, tools, and products to organizations in a wide range of industries. She's widely recognized and respected information security, privacy, and compliance.
Thank you very much. And welcome, everyone. I'm really excited for this panel because I've been working in this space, as indicated, for a long time. I started as a systems engineer, and now I have my own businesses. And I work with a lot of healthcare organizations, medical devices in the past 5 years, very heavily. And they've made some very interesting remarks to me about what the FDA thinks about this, or what the HHS doesn't think about compliance with HIPAA and PHI, and also the standards that are or not available. So I was just thrilled. This is my dream team of folks to discuss these issues, and they can discuss it together because now we have them all here. So if somebody says, oh, they aren't really going to address that, then we have rebuttal opportunities. So for the next hour and 20 minutes or so, we are going to go through, and I have some starting questions for them. If you have a question, I provided Joanne with some note cards, and please write them on the note card so that way we can keep the flow going. If we get into a topic and I cut it so we can go on to the next question, but you still have questions, after lunch is going to be a great time to continue that discussion, or tonight after the event, if the guys are hanging around, why then you can discuss it more then. But definitely let us know what you think. So we'll start out, go from this side of the table there, if you can let us know your name, organization, and then we'll get into the questions after everyone's introduced.
So my name is Seth Carmody. I am a cybersecurity project manager at the FDA, which is a newly recently created position to manage all of the projects that are going on inside the center, cybersecurity-wise. I started off in the FDA as a medical device reviewer, and I worked on diabetes devices, and that was the pre-market work. And then in my post-market work, I worked on software-related recalls that pertain to any medical device that would roll in. For the last couple of years, 3 or 4 years, I've been working on cybersecurity policy specifically, and I'm very familiar with the pre-market guidance and post-market guidance, and I'll be happy to answer any questions related to that.
Hi, my name is Gavin O'Brien. I work at NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology. Some of you here may know it as the old National Bureau of Standards. We maintain your weights and measures, your atomic clock, things like that. I'm a computer scientist, and 4 years ago we started the National Cybersecurity Center of Excellence. It's sort of a joint venture between the federal government, Maryland, and Montgomery County, where we're located. The idea there is we're trying to accelerate the adoption of security technology into industry. I run the healthcare sector, and we have our first project was on EHRs and mobility, where we published what we call as a practice guide. And our second project, which we're currently working on, is on wireless infusion pumps.
Hi everyone, my name is Nick Heasters. So I work with the HHS Office for Civil Rights in their Health Information Privacy Division, which has responsibility for enforcement and compliance with the HIPAA rules. So in that capacity, I assist some of our regional offices with their investigations and compliance reviews, and also work on some of our guidance materials that we publish and some of the interagency work that we do with other organizations such as ONC and NIST and whatnot.
Good morning. My name is Mike Garrity. I'm the director of the New Jersey Cybersecurity and Communications Integration Cell, and right now the acting Chief Information Security Officer for the state of New Jersey. Happy to be here, happy to participate in this. A long time ago, I was a detective in the state police here in New Jersey. I started a high-tech crimes unit. Later on, went into various fields. I was Chief Information Security Officer at a Fortune 100 company. Chief Information Officer. So I've looked at the problem of cybersecurity in a lot of different ways, from an investigator to somebody trying to defend against it to somebody trying to build systems. So I think I have a pretty good perspective, from all sides here.
Good morning. My name is Bill Ash. I'm the Strategic Technology Program Director in the IEEE Standards Association. For those that may not be familiar, IEEE is the Institute for Electrical and Electronics Engineers. We're about 430,000 members around the world, made up of scientists, technologists, and engineering, as well as physicians and other technology areas. I cover e-health for the Standards Association, so I work in the standards group dealing with standardization for incubation work, standardization of actual standards, and market acceptance like conformity assessment programs and such. I've been with the IEEE for a little over 13 years in different areas. I am an engineer, an electrical engineer by education, RF engineer by training, and now a standards person. I am not a security expert. However, we're dealing with medical devices and data exchange and interoperability. Security and privacy becomes a huge issue, which we've been dealing with now for a little bit of time in the IEEE.
Great, okay, so now we're going to get into some initial questions. And certainly when I talk with a lot of the medical device vendors and representatives and engineers, the first thing they bring up is the fact that, well, the FDA is the organization that tells us what to do. So we do what they tell us we legally have to do. And if we don't legally have to do it, we kind of consider that information as, recommendations, or something that isn't something that we're going to get knocked out of contention for if we want to use a medical device. So you mentioned that you have the Post-Market Management of Cybersecurity in Medical Devices document, and you were the primary author of that, I believe?
I think that's too much credit. But
Oh, okay. So you led the effort, and that came out. And, I went to some of the medical device folks I know, and I said, just a week or two ago, because I wanted to prepare for this, and I said, so have you read that document? Because I've been telling you you need security and privacy built into these for so long. Have you read that? And they're like, well, did they issue anything to say we had to read it? And so my question to you is, have you been keeping track of how many downloads you've had of that, and how many organizations are actually putting it to use and getting a lot of questions about that?
As far as I know, we don't have any specific data in terms of numbers of downloads, but I've received plenty of feedback from our stakeholders.
And what kind of feedback? I'm just curious. Are they saying that's something they'll proactively do, or?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think we've had overwhelmingly positive feedback on the document. I think its strength is that it's based in current regulation. So the folks that say that there's no specific law for cyber, I think that's a myth. CF 21 CFR 820 requires risk assessment, and cyber risk would fall right into there. So there actually is legal precedent. In terms of the reception, I think people are happy that it is a sufficiently flexible document. It is again, interpretation of current regulation as we see it as it pertains to cyber. And it also is a document that's built to not upend any particular process in your organizations. It's really meant to be a blend of, say, current standards that are out there in terms of cyber, blend risk assessment frameworks such as 14971, and also to map to your quality management system where we believe that those processes will be implemented. So it's really a flexible framework that people can blend into their existing processes, and I think that's the strength of the document.
Great. Any comments or questions about that from the rest of the panel? Okay, well, we'll start out. We know we have guidance out there now. So another area I've worked with a very long time is in the healthcare space and with HIPAA. I have a lot of clients who are covered entities as well as business associates. Many of those business associates are vendors, or they have access into networks through medical devices or other types of devices. So when I'm working with them, I'm saying, well, have you addressed the HIPAA requirements since you're getting in there as a VA? Mostly they tell me, at least initially, before I've had a chance to really sit down with them for a long time, HIPAA does not apply to us. We are medical device vendors and we follow the FDA requirements, so we don't have to worry about HIPAA. So from, as far as Nick, from an OCR point of view, what's your point of view with regard to what medical device folks should be thinking about if they actually are business associates under HIPAA, and what are some tips that you can give to them about that?
Sure. And there are certainly situations where those vendors would be considered business associates under our definition. We have FAQs on the website, which goes through different scenarios, which would discuss where a vendor, a medical device vendor, might be considered to be providing treatment to a patient, so they wouldn't be a VA in that instance, or if they're getting health information because of a public health disclosure, because of a FDA controlled device. But other than those exceptions, if in the context of providing support, having support personnel have access remotely to a device that is going to create, maintain, transmit PHI, have support personnel go on site to a facility to have physical access to those devices where there is PHI, we would consider those to be business associates, because the provisions of access to that data has been made with the level of access that is permitted from those support personnel that has access to the devices, and hence to the PHI that is maintained on those devices. So as far as what my suggestions would be to look at whether or not they feel they are a VA, and if given this discussion now they may want to change that view, that they should work with their CEs, their covered entities, to really ascertain what that level of interaction, the use of disclosures of PHI they have with the CE, and to make sure that there is that they negotiate a proper BAA with the covered entity, and make sure they have that BAA is in place, and to look at the security rule and potentially privacy rule provisions that would be applicable to them, based on their the use of disclosure they're going to have access to, and to put an appropriate HIPAA compliance program in place that would address those issues.
Well, and to your point about the HIPAA compliance program, some of the medical device folks have told me who are VAs, and so they finally now say, we understand we're VAs, but we have encryption in place. We use two-factor authentication. And then I get into, well, what about your program? What about your documented policies and procedures and so on? Because under HIPAA, you have administrative requirements, technology requirements, and physical requirements, that you have to meet all of those as a VA. And so when I point them out, oftentimes they'll say, those other things don't apply to us because we're just dealing with technology. So I don't know if you've run across that as well in any communications with some of the VAs about how they don't have to follow all three of those areas if they're only a medical device, or if they're only a cloud service provider, because I've heard that same argument from them as well.
Well, it would depend. It would depend on what their services are, their level of use and disclosures, the PHI, as to what parts would apply to them. So if there is a vendor that just goes on site and deals with a particular device or what have you on site from a support perspective, and the CE owns that device, there may be no need for physical safeguards, physical facility security plan, because the PHI on that device is not in the facility of that VA. However, if the vendor maybe leases that device to the CE or provides additional services like some type of disposal, we had the discussion with the eBay, things found on eBay. If they provide those services to take those devices back, to refurbish them, to dispose of them, then you're going to have those issues come into play. There's requirements for disposal control, for reuse requirements, for the facility access plan, and those controls come into place for the depot that would house those machines, things like that. It's not directly on point because it's not a medical device, but we have had a resolution agreement with a health insurance provider in New York with a copier machine, and that was a leased device that was sold on eBay, and health information was retrieved from the hard drive on the copier machine, and we did pursue enforcement activities against that entity because they did not properly account for that in a risk analysis and did not properly ensure the disposal of that PHI.
And I think that's a very important, good example, important point for everyone to understand well. So we have two regulatory agencies now. Give you a little background on what they're looking for. So how are you going to meet some of these security requirements? Well, you can look to standards, right? So first, let's consider NIST. And Gavin told us a little bit about what he's doing. And I know from working with NIST since 2009 on the smart grid research for their security and privacy, it's very much in parallel to what could be going on with medical device security and privacy too. The issues are kind of the same, even though different industries. So I know that from what you've told me before this session, that you actually have some specific research and work going on with medical devices. And I was wondering if you could tell us, the specific type of device and then what you're doing to provide guidance for standards within those devices and maybe how our audience can use that information.
Sure. So at this center, we're about practical cybersecurity, but at NIST, they're more the standards creation area. So if I were in the information technology lab, which I used to be in, and I was working in the computer security division, I would be working on particular like 800 series documents. At the center, we're publishing now this new 1800 series document, which is a guide to show you a way to secure something. We have a bunch of different sectors at the center. We have financial, retail, transportation. And in our particular area, we have a guide out about EHRs and mobility, and it's really more about securing PHI in enterprise when you get in and look at this guide. And we try to do sort of a soup to nuts approach where we start off with a risk assessment and we go through all that analysis. We write an initial white paper talking about the problem area and describing the challenges, which we've already done for this wireless infusion pump project we're currently working on. And then we put out, once we get that paper correct, sometimes there's a little back and forth with the industry, and I should point out one of the other reasons I'm here is to promote our sector, and if you can send me your information, we have a community of interest where we like to have a public call every month or two, and we use that community to try and get ideas about the next projects and also to get feedback on our current projects. For vendors, it's a place to know what's going on and what our next project is and how to get involved. So with the wireless infusion pump project, we produced a notice, a Federal Register notice to ask companies to come work on this project. Currently, we're working with about 17 companies on the wireless infusion pump project. We've broken the group into four subgroups. So we have 5 pump vendors. Smiths Medical, Ebron, Hospira, who's now Pfizer, CareFusion, who's now Becton Dickinson, and then we have Baxter. So it's a good set of companies. That makes our pump subgroup. We have a risk assessment group. Company called Clearwater Compliance, so that ties us into, they do focus more on HIPAA-related issues. We have MDIS with Dale Nordenberg. We're going to use his MDRAP sort of assessment tool. We have a company called Ramparts that does specifically risk assessment and also some testing. And then a lot of you may know Kevin Fu has a company called Verta Labs, and he has a monitoring tool that he feels will not tip over every time the networks are touched. So that rounds out our risk assessment group. We have a sort of a cybersecurity infrastructure group, which is some bigger name companies, Cisco, Symantec, Computer Associates, and a small company called TDI Technologies. And finally, we have a sort of our catch-all group, which is our focus cybersecurity group. We have some companies in there that have some physical security things. DigiCert has some digital certificate stuff. So a great set of companies. And what we will do is come together and we build an architecture. We go through a risk assessment. We do the kind of things that maybe providers, to show them an example of what maybe they should be doing. But if they don't do it now, they can come and steal our stuff and jumpstart their process. And then give them an idea of the technologies that will help surround these pumps. So I talked earlier when Kevin was talking about this tension between the provider and the vendor. And so in some sense, I think this kind of project will help define that line, talk a little bit about what providers should do in terms of compensating controls, and also try and push the vendors to do all of the things that Kevin had pointed out in his presentation.
Oh, that would be great. And for those of you who might not be familiar with the NIST site, they have so much really great security and privacy guidance. So if you go out to csrc.nist.gov, and I believe if they go there and do a search in the little search area there, they'll probably find your
Yeah, you'll find
information.
common standards. Just to recount some of the important ones. So there's the CSF, or the Cybersecurity Framework, which is really a 50,000 foot view, but I think it's being well received by all organizations. And then we also have a risk management framework, which ties into a lot of the other standards bodies. They sort of reference each other. And then there's also 853, or the security controls, and that's probably, ironically, the most famous, because people oftentimes just jump right into the controls and don't talk about the risk part of it. But I do like to point out the risk part, because that should come first, and then you go into the security controls. And finally, there are just a ton of specialty pubs that are in focused areas. So there's one on sort of HIPAA and mapping that security controls, and just a ton of other stuff.
So definitely a great place to go to find more information. And, so we're talking about standards as far as how to do things and how to set up your program, how to plan for your devices and so on. So where's the next step to go to standards? Well, that's getting down to the nitty-gritty about what kind of standards are we going to actually build into these devices. An organization, another one that I belong to and do work for, is IEEE. And IEEE has a lot of stuff going on to look at what kind of standards can be created and built into these devices. Mitch and I are on one of these newer standards groups, PAR 1912, and that's for the consumer wireless devices and looking at how to build privacy and security into that. But before that, I believe Bill was working on, for a much longer time, at the type of standard to be able to be built into medical devices themselves. So you can look at NIST for, well, here's the things that you need to make sure that you address. Now, how are you going to actually get this accomplished? Well, you can look at the details within IEEE standards.
Yes, so since about the late 90s, we've been dealing with the nomenclatures for medical devices, and the IEEE of actually capturing the codes and the descriptions of what the measurements of the vital signs of the devices. And as of 2014, the IEEE Cybersecurity Initiative put out a building code for medical device software security. And from there, we have our 11073, which deals with our medical devices, has started the initiative on updating their personal healthcare device sector with security information and looking at it from the medical device design aspect of it when integrating the data exchange between the device and a manager. We have roughly about 300 participants out of there, a lot of the manufacturers, a lot of integrators and such. But not only on the device side, as Kevin mentioned this morning, you have the networking aspect of it, the Wi-Fi infrastructure. Our 802 series of groups is looking at privacy and security as well as integrating on the networking side. We also have 2410, which came out in 2014, that deals with biometrics protection and security, so leveraging fingerprints, eye retina readings, things of that nature, so physical security into the system. Kevin mentioned a number of things this morning that dealt with how to access into a network, one being through a cyber event, through a network connection or a device itself, the other being a physical connection into a network and then taking over control. So it's kind of interesting to see all of that as well. And also in IEEE, we deal with a lot of the software engineering and life cycles around software and the processes of developing software systems. We partner with ISO. That was another organization that Kevin had mentioned during his slide deck. So we have an integration of harmonizing between the two organizations working together and such in that space. So between the software side, the hardware side, and the actual data exchange, IEEE has a lot of activities, and we're partnering with a lot of groups, and this being one of them. The FDA just recognized 2 years ago 12 of the standards on the device side. Hopefully with the next generation with security incorporated, they'll be recognized again. So those that are looking to get FDA approval will help speed along the approval process, leveraging those standards.
So you mentioned about the building code for medical device software security. I believe that's the correct title, hopefully.
Yes, it is.
And that came out in mid-2015. So one of the things I know in working on our other IEEE group, one of the questions I had for IEEE was, well, when we get this standard created, how are we going to get people to use it? And they were kind of like, yeah, that's the challenge. So you mentioned that you are working with some other groups to get it out there and to get it known. But do you have any, and this is a question that's coming to me from some of my really techie friends who are going to DEF CON and Black Hat here in the next few days. They said, well, ask the IEEE folks, how do we know that people are actually using these standards, or how widely has it been adopted yet? And I think they're probably planning their next maybe demonstration for next year at one of those events.
So a couple of ways to approach that, or the way we look at it. All of IEEE standards are voluntary until it gets adopted by some authority, like the FDA or something else that has some regulation in place. The other way we look at it, not only through regulation and authority, we look at market acceptance through conformity assessment programs. When you start looking at purchasers and those that are buying the type of products, putting the requirements to meeting standards so that it helps with interoperability and security practices. Looking at certification marks to understand that it actually meets the standard, not just self-compliance, but some third-party validation that the product's been tested or complies with the performance criteria within a standard. Then the other thing that we also do is we look at those that are involved in the working group that are participating, work through those channels as well as help to get the word out that the standard exists. A lot of times folks just don't know it's available, and it's really about educating the community that there is something out there, that they don't need to reinvent the wheel every time, that they can leverage something that exists and allow it, and just giving them the knowledge that there is something out there to help them do their work that they're looking to do. So for instance, 11073 has been around since 2004 as a finished product, but it's only been recently that we've seen an uptake in the document. It's because we're seeing a lot of the interoperability challenges. We're starting to educate the medical facilities that standards does exist in this space to help them with the purchase of product, and giving them those tools to notify the manufacturer, well, we want interoperability, we want to help reduce our cost. This is one way to leverage that. And they're just starting to understand that they have the ability to go through their procurement procedures in order to notify the manufacturers, we need this information within devices to come to us.
Great. Well, hopefully then we'll start seeing more of it as we start talking with more medical device folks who've heard of it and are actually using it. So we've heard from two regulatory areas. We've heard about two different types of standards. You saw this morning the different things that can occur with regard to security risks and potential exploits. So what could this mean to the hospital? What could this mean to Homeland Security? I read something not long ago that I found very interesting. This past February, the Department of Homeland Security actually, within their Security Science and Technology Directorate, they awarded $2.2 million to Adventium Enterprises in Minneapolis, and I'm also a Midwesterner. It's nice to see a lot of Midwesterners here. I'm from Des Moines. But $2.2 million, why would the Department of Homeland Security care about medical device security, and how is that related to, the concerns that exist for what could happen with the medical devices? Maybe if you could speak to that a little bit.
So I could, succinctly, I can say the first three speakers this morning laid out all the things that could go wrong and all the vulnerabilities. So those were some of the reasons there. If you go into a medical facility, a hospital, a doctor's office today, as opposed to 20 years ago, you're going to notice it jumping out at you is the technology that's used, whether it's just in the business operations of the hospital or facility, or if it's in providing patient care. I know going back years ago, neonatal intensive care was just a series of beeps and monitors that went off, and nurses came down to check on them when something went wrong and stuff. Today, those are all networked. And so as we rely more and more on technology, more and more of these vulnerabilities creep in and they present risk. And so managing that risk and what it means to patient care. We've seen other instances, recently with, hospitals having to shut down their IT systems for viruses and malware that have infected them and stuff like that. But all of those issues, the networking of devices, the networking of the business systems, and it's not only those, but it's the networking with all the partners of the hospitals and medical facilities. So, the hospital usually doesn't maintain their HVAC systems. It's going to be a third-party provider that monitors and maintains that. And it's similar to what happened with Target a few years ago. It was that third-party connection where the bad actors came in and put malware on point-of-sale systems and caused that mess there. So I think as we start realizing the interconnectivity, the vulnerabilities, all these devices have operating systems, they have software. We have all these same issues that affect every other business. However, we're talking about the health and safety of patients here. The other thing that we need to look at, and we can't discount, are the threat actors and who they are and what they're going after. In many cases, threat actors are motivated by financial reasons. They want to get in, whether it be ransomware to get Bitcoin money or some other reasons. And what we always think of as far as our threat actors, we keep pointing fingers at the Chinese, the Russians, and these people that we never see, but they must be the smartest people in the world because they're hacking into everything. And that's not the case. The threat actors are the people here in New Jersey. And what we're seeing an increase of are that street gangs that traditionally did things like carjacking, drug sales, prostitutions, and that type of stuff. They're moving into the cyber world. And, so the Bloods, the Crips, and the reason being is that they're educated, they're more technologically savvy than predecessors. It's an easy way to make money. They're indiscriminate of where they, take the money from or commit the crime. And so I think we need to understand that the threat actors are not just these foreign nation states that are attacking us. It's going to be people here. Somebody said this to me the other day up in an FBI meeting, that if you're a criminal and you're not doing cybercrime, that when you get arrested, you should be charged with malfeasance because cybercrime is just continuing to increase.
Oh, definitely. Well, and as you're talking about that, and I was very intrigued with what Shelby was talking about with the denial of service through the RFID emissions. And I'm thinking, well, if you're investing in technology to help defend medical devices from threats, is there somewhere that is going to be posted, or is it going to be considered top secret with regard to some of the research that this organization that got this grant is doing, or at least if they talk about what they're looking at defending against, because I'd love to know if they're looking at ways to defend against that type of denial of service attack.
I think all vectors of attack are what they're looking at, so it's not just denial of service. Denial of service obviously can do that, but, you know, fiddling with the data, changing the integrity of the system, the software, the outputs and stuff like that. I think, you know, those are all aspects of what that research was based.
And will there be some place where we can look at the progress, or is that one of those things where it's done and then maybe a report's given at the end of the?
I think that's more or less what we'll see,
Okay.
not so much the progress.
Okay, sounds great. Well, I'm very intrigued by it, and of course, I like to know what's going on right as soon as it's happening. So right now, I'm going to ask a question, open it up to all of you, or multiple ones of you, to answer. If any of you are thinking of questions as we go along, you have a note card there if you could write your question down, and Joanne or some of her folks who are assisting her today will bring them up and we can look at those. But, you know, something that's a concern to me and a lot of others, even in fact from Department of Health and Human Services, they talked about the concern of now all of these direct-to-consumer fitness trackers and health monitors that are being used to promote good health care, actually being prescribed in many cases by doctors to take that data from those devices and give to your doctor so they can perform analysis and see how you're doing it. And you know, when I read that, I'm kind of scared because I know from some personal experience with one fitness tracker who I asked many questions of over a long period of time before they just told me to basically go away, that they don't have any requirements from their perspective to include security or privacy within those devices or within the ways in which the data is transmitted, how it's shared. The sharing of some of that data will just blow your mind. So when we're thinking about now going out to direct-to-consumer devices, they'll be considered a type of medical device if they're supporting healthcare. What are the views from, you know, the regulators and also from the standards folks with regard to what those fitness tracking vendors should be thinking of as they're creating these devices, and if you foresee a point in time where, you know, HIPAA is very strictly written, the scope is well defined, but if that scope ever gets expanded to cover those types of devices that are direct to consumer. I'll open that up to any of you to offer your thoughts or comments on that.
I mean, one of the things that we've done in regards to this is there are, and we've put out some guidance with various scenarios of you know, personal devices or devices that people use on their person that, you know, could be used in this manner, and the guidance was really for those device manufacturers to help them determine whether or not they would be a business associate to determine, you know, the degree of compliance with HIPAA that would be required of them. So I mean, there are, as Rebecca already said, there's well-defined definitions out there that the manufacturer is going to have to you know, have that information would be for, you know, on behalf of the covered entity for them to fall under that category. If you know, a person goes into Target and, you know, buy their Fitbit, obviously there is, you know, no protection of the device other than what Fitbit says it'll do. But you know, for, you know, devices or manufacturers that are, you know, collecting and are sharing that data, you know, with our provider, you know, disclosing information, you know, on behalf of the provider, because they're the ones that need it from the user, you know, then there would be a business associated relationship with that provider, and they would have to take appropriate steps to, you know, protect that data they're going to maintain on behalf of the provider they collect.
You know, and when you say that, it reminds me back a few years, several years now ago, when folks started using the Amazon managed service provider hosting. And at that point in time, it was like, no, we aren't business associates. You know, we're just providing your managed services, providing service. Well, now, after, you know, time goes on, they realize that Well, yeah, I guess we are business associates, so they actually do have a place out there to look at that. And maybe it'll get to that point with medical devices too, or health trackers too. But I do want to say that for some of those very popularly owned ones, the FTC might be another regulatory agency that you have a pathway through, because one well-known one that I called up, on their privacy policy that's posted, it says, we will tell you what we're doing with your personal information and also who we share it with. So I took them up on that offer. I called them up and I said, well, tell me all the different types of data, and I listed out about 50 different things that I knew they were probably collecting. Can you tell me which of these things you're collecting, how frequently you're collecting them, and then to whom you're sharing them? And they came back and told me, we can't tell you that. I said, well, but your privacy policy says that you're going to tell me that. And they said, well, it's a privacy issue. I said, I know, I'm concerned about my privacy. And after back and forth, they finally came back and said, well, actually, it's an intellectual property issue. They didn't want to tell me because they felt that if they told me all the details that I asked for, it would give their competitors too much information and take away some of their competitive capabilities. So I think that's another issue that maybe the regulators might want to keep in mind, if you aren't already, the fact that personal data that's now being collected through medical devices oftentimes is not looked at as personal data. It's looked at as the owner, the vendor's personally owned intellectual property data. So that's another issue. Were you going to have a comment earlier? I thought I saw you.
Well, just to say that those health trackers are not actually medical devices. They're considered probably general wellness or low-risk technological devices. So this wouldn't implicate FDA. They're not subject to 510(k) clearance or PMA approval.
So that's a key thing there as far as FDA goes. You look at whether or not they have to fall under those specific.
Yeah, it has to meet the definition of a medical device.
Okay. So, and that's where maybe between the Department of Health and Human Services and the FDA, you might get into a little divergent pathways, because if the doctor says that they're using that data to provide care, that would be one thing from a HIPAA standpoint as opposed to the FDA medical device standpoint. I got a really great question. This will be for my standards folks, starting out with NIST, and I hear this a lot too. There's feedback from different vendors, especially a lot of them come from outside of the United States, right? But those devices are used worldwide. So there's feedback that when I reference, and this is a question again from the audience, when I reference NIST cybersecurity frameworks and other guidance documents, they say, well, it's US focused, and so it doesn't really apply to them, and it's not globally recognized, and so they tell us that they aren't going to use that. So what would be a proper response, if you have a proper response, to vendors who say we don't want to use a recommended standard because they feel it's too US focused and US centric?
That's a good question. So really our mandate in terms of standards is for other federal agencies. So in general, when we're building these standards, we're building them for the other federal agencies, but by and large, they're good for the general public as well. So we don't go beyond that. But as a general rule, and one interesting thing is that NIST is part of the Department of Commerce. So although it's pretty cool to make standards, we just don't make standards because it's cool. So we like to leverage other organizations if they're already making those standards or point to other places. So if other organizations are doing a good job of that, we don't necessarily want to get involved. Because we're part of the Department of Commerce, we love to see the marketplace take care of itself. So, so I would say then that you could leverage the marketplace for that. I did want to touch back on the previous question, and just in that it is interesting that this wearable thing is sort of follows this common cycle of, and you get this a lot in research, in that you build a widget and you build that widget to do the thing you want the widget to do, and usually security doesn't come into play there. Oftentimes, human factors doesn't necessarily come into play either. And you want that thing to do what it's supposed to do, and then it kind of catches on. And so then you're in this cycle. So in some sense, when you ask that question, I'm a little, exasperated, just because here I am trying to work on infusion pumps and things that are within the hospitals, trying to get those secure. And now we've got this whole new set of things out there that doesn't take security into account, and we're going to secure things in the hospital. So I think it is just sort of a life cycle thing about how things are invented and how they come on board. And some people may argue with me, but if that is the way that things come to be, maybe, and I do want to promote building security in, that's definitely, as things mature, you have to do that. But maybe as a stopgap, bolting security on or having countermeasures for those newer things is something that you've got to have to.
Oh, definitely.
I'd just like to touch on something really fundamentally important to all of our efforts, and that is as it relates to the medical device space. What we're trying to do is we're trying to shift that risk focus from intended use, add a risk focus from, in addition to the intended use, to reasonable, foreseeable misuse. And that's where all the pain points come from, because these things, getting down even to the fitness trackers, they're built for a specific purpose. Medical devices, the intended use, the medical, the clinical functionality. So now we're in a space, and our guidance, again, provides this flexibility to manage this type of risk in terms of, reasonable, foreseeable misuse. Now that could be malicious misuse from our threat actors, but don't forget that folks like Kevin has mentioned too, your own people on your property that may inadvertently do something to trigger an event. So that's really where all of our pain points are, is that focusing on intended use. And the companies will say, oh, we don't need to do that and all that other stuff. I mean, you better get on board, because even to ride the bus, ticket to ride the bus is to bake that security in and start focusing on reasonable, foreseeable misuse.
Sure. And then I have a follow-up for you about the standards part.
Sure. I'd like to touch a little bit more on that. I think we need to have the manufacturers and our industry start looking at them as just one-off device and look at it as a system integration. And instead of looking at it as just my device meets X, it needs to look at how it gets integrated into a system environment. If we look at a certification alliance like Continuum, right? They take the device and look at it from the digital exchange of information from the device all the way to a clinical gateway, and look at a certification based on the interoperability from that. If we take that one step further and actually add security measures into that and protection, and look at it as a system integration and not just a one-off device, that's probably a start. It is a challenge, a tall order, but that's one way to start looking at it, especially if we look at IoT and we start thinking of how much connectivity that the human body will have. And those today may not be considered medical devices like Fitbit and others, but in the future, they most likely will be, because clinical environments are starting to capture that data and look at the trends on how it's doing medical advantages and using that information to the best of their ability.
Very great points. And I want to quickly go back to the US-centric standard and go to the IEEE, because you made very good points about how they could respond to that, or the intentions, but IEEE is an international organization, and so what you're creating there is usable and is being used as far as your standards worldwide. And I anticipate, just based on what I'm doing with this other group, we're looking at providing some advice about frameworks for an organization's security and privacy program, in addition to the very specific technical standards. So what would you say to that with regard to that standard being used?
So from the IEEE's perspective, we are an international organization. We have 20,000 participants in our standards environment from 160 countries. We look at 11073 on the nomenclature side. The FDA recognized those standards. We also partner with ISO and CEN, who adopt those standards into the European market. Our co-chair for our personal healthcare device, Daidi Zhang, just got an award recognized in China for being an innovative standards developer from the 11073 IEEE, so they're being recognized in China. We also have participants from India, Korea, and Latin America that are all integrating into these devices. And we have to think about it too. The other question is a lot of these manufacturers may not be just in the US, but they are selling to a US market, meeting, let's say, FDA requirements. The European version of the FDA are also looking at the FDA to see what they're doing to mirror some of those requirements, to adopt them, to leverage best practices. Nobody wants to reinvent the wheel if something exists. So if some requirements exist, those other countries and requirement bodies or regulatory bodies are looking at the US and others to see what the best practices are. So although somebody may say, well, the NIST on cybersecurity is US based, however, these are best practices that could be leveraged around the world.
I just want to add there, in these frameworks, whether it be NIST or ISO, or you can go even to PCI and others, they map to one another. So it's just a way of attacking the same problem. And whether you're doing this, you can map that to ISO standards as well. So I don't think there should be that discrimination between the different standards as saying one is US based or not.
Just to follow on, so just to make sure folks are clear, so FDA does not require folks to prescribe to any particular standards. Our standards recognition process is voluntary, and manufacturers are on a voluntary basis to declare conformity to any particular standard. I'm a standards guy, I support standards, I'm just saying.
That's a great clarification, so definitely appreciate that. Now, a little bit different question, but this is for you, Michael, because, when you think about terrorism and all that and what the Department of Homeland Security does, here's a question specifically for you. In light of the evolving threat environment in cybersecurity on both the federal and the state levels, what is the New Jersey Office of Homeland Security and Preparedness doing with regard to the healthcare sector and device manufacturers? Are you doing anything specifically that's different than what the overall grant activities are that is coming from the federal?
So let me give you some background on the New Jersey Cybersecurity and Communications Integration Center. It's a mouthful to say, NJCIC for short. It was created about a year ago in May 2015 to be a one-stop shop cybersecurity information sharing, threat intelligence, and resource for the state of New Jersey. And that's going to be all sectors from critical infrastructure to healthcare. So we provide services, we provide products, which is threat intelligence that specifically targets the healthcare industry. We do it for other industries and other sectors as well. So our give back to the state of New Jersey, or what the service we're providing is so that we can provide you focused intelligence on threats to your environment, whether it be healthcare or banking or another area, that at the federal level, you may not get that specificity.
Okay. That's great to know.
Okay. And for those that are interested more in looking to see what we're providing, you can join us as a member. There's no cost. And you can just visit our website at cyber.nj.gov, and you can get a whole lot more information
Great.
about what we do there.
Definitely look there for sure. Another question, this has to do with, let's go back to HIPAA compliance. So this morning, we were shown all these devices that were actually used in the provisioning of care, purchased on eBay with all the PHI located on them. Is that considered a breach under HIPAA? And what should be done when you discover PHI on medical devices that are being sold on eBay? I mean, is that something that the Department of Health and Human Services would go to eBay to say, where did you get these devices from, so you could track it down, or how would that work?
Well, I don't think we're going to go buy eBay devices, but when there are reports of that kind of activity, certainly we would open up an investigation, and that's exactly what happened with the Affinity Health with the copier machine. I believe that was a 60 Minutes portion on the dangers of information left on copy machines that are off lease and sold on eBay and whatnot. And as part of the story, they purchased many of these devices, and they had information from different sectors, not only healthcare information, but this one did have healthcare information on it, so that was something that what was part of the news cycle. That is a breach of PHI, and that was something that we pursued an investigation about.
So if you were able to find the hospital or whomever that sold it, then that would be something you'd probably open an investigation with. And it kind of leads to my next question that's more general. And this is something, those of you in the information security space, you probably heard this a lot. Well, you can't guarantee 100% security. Well, of course not. You need to demonstrate due diligence. You need to do all that's necessary to mitigate risk to acceptable levels, right? But the question is, at the end of the day, when somebody does have a hack on a medical device, maybe at a hospital, or maybe in a clinic, or maybe through the vendor who's providing it, and supposedly they were following all of the regulations and so on, what is considered by the regulators when they actually look at the situation? I mean, as far as, what types of information are you going to ask them for when you're looking at something that had a breach occur with a medical device?
Sure. Well, first I'll go back to talk about how we initiate investigations and where those come from. For the Affinity Healthcare, the 60 Minutes story, 60 Minutes contacted Affinity Health that this was what they found, and they were going to do a story on it. And as their obligation under HIPAA, Affinity self-reported that as a breach. So that, because of that report of a breach, that initiated that investigation. If there are issues that do come up in the news cycle, that I think one of our other big ones was a few years ago, a reporter did some dumpster diving in a pharmacy chain dumpster and found a bunch of pharmacy paperwork that wasn't shredded and whatnot. That was something that we opened up an investigation on because of that news report. Complaints. Anybody can issue a HIPAA complaint or potential violation on HIPAA entity or business associate. So we get those all the time from patients that feel that their information may not be secure or may have been improperly disclosed or whatnot. Employees may feel that the organization isn't doing enough, has issues with individual disclosures, and they may report or file a complaint on their employer. And compliance reviews. If there are issues involved with a business associate, that a vendor has highlighted or to us based on some other activity that we've had of that common entity, we may initiate a compliance review of the organization. Now, going back to what we look at when we do that investigation or a compliance review, we want to look at what the degree of compliance is with HIPAA. And one of the things that, if anyone has been engaged with our investigators, one of the areas that we always ask for, and we've heard this talked about here on this panel, is the risk analysis process and risk management, because that is the foundation of any cybersecurity program, is to understand what are the risks to the PHI in my environment. HIPAA controls apply to all the ePHI the entity is going to create, receive, maintain, or transmit. And the risk analysis has to take that into consideration. You have to know where your PHI is living, what type of devices you have. You have to have an inventory. You need to know where all the PHI is going to be. Is it obviously your EHR systems, your PM systems, medical devices, but also the stray Word doc or spreadsheet on this workstation or that workstation. An email system where people are emailing information that has billing information of particular patients to a collection agency or something like that. All of those things are going to be health information, and they need to be considered as part of that process for analyzing what are the risks to the PHI within those environments. And once that's done in an accurate and thorough manner, and it's documented to support the activity, you have done that's the first step that we always have in making sure that that's been done. So the next part that we want to see is, okay, so what's the risk management process you have in place to mitigate or remediate those risks? now that you've identified these risks, you need to take steps to reduce those risks to a reasonable and appropriate level. And we want to know what that process is, and we want to see some kind of documentation that those risks that are at a high or a higher level, that there are some type of plans in place, to have some kind of process in place to either have already remediated and mitigated those issues, or that there are processes in place to go forward and reduce those risks. We understand that there are zero-day vulnerabilities. So, certainly if some hacker organization comes in and, potentially, state actor, things like that, that there are issues that aren't going to be able to be defended against from that standpoint. And I don't think that that's something that we're going to, ding someone on to not properly analyze the risk of something that was as an unknown. But, once that's happened, we do expect that other requirements in HIPAA would kick in. So although that risk may have been exploited and there was really nothing to potentially prevent that exploitation, once that hacker or that malware is in the system, there are requirements to have audit controls in place, to have system activity reviews in place. And we would expect that those controls, those processes would be able to detect malicious activity within the environment. So if you have a zero-day exploit where your hackers are rummaging your system for over a year, that might save you on them getting in, but it's not going to save you for not seeing that for over a year. So obviously those processes either weren't in place, or if they were in place, they were ineffective.
Well, and I would like to make a couple of points to all of that great information. Number one, document. So many organizations have really bad documentation practices. If you can't document what happened, it basically didn't happen, right? If you can't prove it, so you got to document. And to your point earlier about how many ways that you can go in to do a review or an audit after a breach or just as a regularly scheduled audit, keep in mind that each and every one of the 50 Attorney General's offices also have enforcement capabilities for HIPAA. A lot of organizations don't realize that. And so some of the states have been looking at and doing their own audits for HIPAA compliance, because now they have that authority to do so. So I think that's important to keep in mind as well. Were you going to say something?
So again, going back to our guidance document and realizing that these types of breaches occur, which I would categorize as harm to confidentiality. If it's, let's say there's a medical device that is has sending information, PHI, clear text, and it results in one of these breaches, that the guidance document actually provides a mechanism for medical device manufacturers to update their device such that we can prevent that breach from happening. So you're making a lot of nice points about, like what is due diligence, and part of that due diligence is sort of sealing the gap, right? So FDA doesn't want to be an impediment to seeing that gap, as long as there's no patient harm, physical injury, and that's one of the edicts of FDA, physical harm to patients, is that as long as there's no risk of that go ahead and close that gap, and you don't need to come to talk to the FDA. In times past, before this post-market guidance came out, that might necessitate corrective action, and a corrective action in terms of correction and removal, and starts to get into things like AO6 reporting, which we've actually used enforcement discretion in these such cases. So we are aligning with what's going on out there in terms of confidentiality harms, and allowing people to go fix things that they're seeing in the field.
Now, I have a couple of questions that are very similar, and this kind of goes to all of you, really. So, given the interplay and how much all of you are really supporting each other, you have your guidelines and your regulations, and you're looking out for safety, and you have standards of various types. Given how you are all kind of supporting each other, do you all have a group, or do you do any type of regular communications or meetings with each other about these topics, or have you planned to put out a cooperative type of recommendations or comments paper or white paper, if you will, that would show everybody's viewpoint in one location, so that those who are medical device manufacturers or even others in the healthcare space can see that everyone is communicating on this.
I'm going to try and answer this a little bit. Also, we're a little bit more downstream from FDA and also from the Office of Civil Rights in that we don't have regulatory authority or we're not investigating breaches. So when we put out our practice guides, and in both cases of our guides, we've contacted both organizations. I would say we talk periodically, but it's almost monthly. In fact, yesterday I had a group to go through it. Interestingly enough, at our center, we have a federally funded research and development center that helps us man our site, if you will, and that's run by MITRE. And coincidentally, FDA has an FFRDC, and I think the ONC, certainly DHS has, HHS has an FFRDC as well, and so through MITRE, that is helping us also coordinate because they're reaching back through their organization and helping us coordinate there. So that's probably part of the story.
And I think I even belong, they have a mail list, right, that anybody can belong to, because I'm on a mail list about medical device security and privacy, and MITRE is the host for it, so that might be it. Other comments from any of you about?
Within the NJ kit, we have a partnerships branch, and we realize that no one entity is going to have a corner on the market as far as cybersecurity best practices or regulations or standards. And so what we try and do with that partnership branch is to reach out to all the different organizations, New Jersey Hospitals Association, the BPU, and others, and at the federal level and everything, so that we can bring that all together into one package and provide that information out to those that we're trying to serve. So that relationship has been developed and is developing, and that's one thing that we want to expand upon. And that's one of the reasons that we created this cybersecurity and communications integration center.
Great. Now I have a couple of questions. First I'll go to the FDA and then to IEEE. So for the FDA, do you know when the FDA will finalize that post-market guidance? So there's the final version, and is there still opportunity to provide feedback on it?
Comment period closed April 21st of this year, so I don't believe so. There may be some language, and I'm forgetting specifically where it comes from, that you can submit comments at any time, but I think that may be per guidance, so I may see that's with respect to another guidance. The finalization, we received all the public docket comments, so we are adjudicating those at present. There's really a lot of forces that go into, say, finalizing a guidance that we don't really necessarily have, I don't have direct control over. So we are working as hard as we can, and it will be out when it's out.
Okay. And for the IEEE, with your standard, is that standard one that is in its final form now? And if so, do you have plans then to continue to maintain it or update it going forward?
So all of IEEE standards are living, breathing documents until they're withdrawn. So basically, every standard has to be revised within a 10-year period at the latest. So the 11073 work going on right now is actually a full revision of the base on the personal health care side. So from that perspective, it's open to anybody who wants to participate, and it's currently going through revision right now to have security incorporated into it. So yeah.
Great. And another one, this one's for the FDA, HHS, and then also bringing in the FTC. So it looks like sometimes there are conflicts between the FDA, HHS, and FTC over what is really required for not only medical devices, but also consumer devices and security. So how do you overcome any conflicts between what the published opinions are about what is necessary for minimum security within those types of devices, the requirements?
I don't see any particular conflicts, so maybe a follow-up would be in order. Somebody, the questioner can articulate. But I will say that FDA, their edict is safety and effectiveness, so meaning that you're not causing physical harm to the patient and that it does what you say it does. So in terms of cyber, risks to either of those two things are of concern. And I don't know exactly where that overlaps with other regulatory organizations.
And OCR, we work with other government agencies on these issues, and I've had the pleasure of working with Gavin before, but we've worked with other folks on this, on various guidance materials and whatnot, and work with ONC on some of their issues on security for certifying EHR systems, and we've also collaborated with FDA on security of medical devices and things like that. So I think there's a prior question about white papers and how we do things. So we all do talk, and we all get together and collaborate and review each other's works as appropriately for comments and consider each other's positions on various things regarding cybersecurity. And I think this question, it seems like this goes back to one of the things that was touched upon in some of the earlier sessions as to where is that line drawn between what does the device manufacturer include in the device, what is the covered entity responsible for. And that is something that is kind of problematic. I mean, we OCR is very supportive of the guidance that FDA has put out, and also some of Gavin's comments. We certainly want to see that security life cycle, cybersecurity life cycle, have that security built in. Always better than having to have that those issues handled from a bolt-on perspective. But when you do look at what's required under HIPAA. You are required to, government entities and VAs are required to implement reasonable and appropriate security measures within certain boundaries. What is the complexity of the organization? What is there's a flexibility of approach to take these into consideration. In addition to the size and complexity of the organization, there's also areas for what are the capabilities of the infrastructure, of the hardware, of the software, and security involved. So to the extent that your risk analysis indicates that a particular medical device or older EHR system or whatever it is, doesn't have appropriate security as part of it, and a vendor is unwilling or unable, they are out of business to be able to support the level of security that's required, then the entity needs to take those compensating controls. They may have to isolate that device, so there is no network connectivity to take, other areas to ensure, the security of the PHI that's on that device. And one of the things that we hope as, from a built-in perspective, is that, and I think this was also touched upon in an earlier session, was that, as entities and hospitals and whatnot, when they look at, different medical devices, and they're looking at, the risk analysis and having to go through the cost of implementing compensating controls for a non-secure device and potentially not being able to use some of the features that the marketers might tout because it involves connectivity or other issues that the compensating controls are going to negate. And there's another device that does a function, but it is done with built-in security to make it more secure. We would hope that the power of the marketplace would arc over to those secure solutions. We have had a recent investigation and resolution agreement in regards to a medical device. And you may have seen this was the Lady case. It was a CT system, a CT scanner and a laptop that drove the scanner device. And we, as I talked about before, there was no risk analysis done of that particular device and setup. Someone disconnected the laptop and the application and data from the laptop and walked out with it. Well, there were obviously not physical controls in place to prevent that from happening, and there were other things that we found in the laptop. I mean, there wasn't any a unique login to the laptop. There was no activity review of those kind of systems. So there are other HIPAA controls that we would have expected to have seen in this type of environment, which didn't exist. And that is a published resolution agreement that folks can go out there on our website and can look at that if they want to.
And if and I'm not sure what was in the mind of the questioner with that, but it brought up an example that I had with a conversation with a medical device vendor last year, and it was about encryption. And it's not really conflicting information from the different areas, but it's just different messages. So they said, well, do we have to use encryption that is found in NIST, minimum recommended NIST requirement, encryption requirements, if we're going to use encryption? Because they said HIPAA does point to NIST documents within the guidance, but it doesn't say explicitly the type of encryption to use, which makes sense. You're pointing to others. But then they come and say, but FDA says we don't need to use encryption, or they don't specify that the strength of encryption. So maybe with that, if somebody came to each of you and said, what's the minimum type of encryption algorithm that we need to use if we're going to be accessing data from medical devices remotely in order to maintain them and service them, what would you say to them from your organizations? Would maybe you point to a standards group, or, I mean?
Well, I mean, this guidance documents are updated by NIST, and our guidance that references what NIST has to say for encryption in motion and in transmission. In particular, those documents for encryption for data in transmission over the network have been updated as various protocols have become more and more insecure. As there's been increasing vulnerabilities of SSL2, SSL3, those documents have been updated to reflect those vulnerabilities and to escalate, what is an appropriate level of encryption to use in those transmission situations. And because our guidance to render PHI, unreadable, unusable, indecipherable, references those guidance documents as they change, our guidance incorporates them by references with those changes.
So that's what you would look at if you went in to do an audit under HIPAA. If FDA went in to do an audit, is that something that you would consider and look at too, in a similar manner?
The manufacturer is responsible for performing that risk analysis and saying, what is at stake in terms of sending things in the clear, right? We're never going to be prescriptive for reasons that, Nick, is it Nick? Right. Correct, fantastic. Just describe. You don't want to provide a one encryption algorithm because it's fast outdated. So if a manufacturer doesn't identify that encryption is necessary, then the review staff, a reviewer would never say, keep people from using encryption. If they would come and say, okay, I see in your risk analysis you're sending PHI, there are HIPAA-related questions here. How are you protecting the data? So that's the type of question that would be asked. So at the review level, not necessarily at an audit level. So the kind of concepts that are going on there, like, oh, FDA wouldn't allow that, or wouldn't ask about it. Like, I don't understand that. So certainly the reviewer would say, look at the device, how it functions, and say, okay, there's risks here associated with sending data. What are you doing to control those risks?
Great. Well, we're out at our time. Before we leave, I do want to, just a couple more things really quick. I did provide you with a couple of things that I created. I have an infographic. I like to consider all the ways in which health data can be shared. So you have a printout of that. I have it on my website also. So that infographic is something I put together fairly recently, maybe 6-7 months ago. And then I gave you a checklist that I provide to my clients for medical device security and privacy. So happy for you to take that. And then also I want to thank very much my panel members. I really enjoyed hearing all of your thoughts. I think it's been very informative. Let's give them a big round of applause for all of